Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. We are starting today. We're in Mark chapter 6, starting in verse 45 and rolling through verse 52. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side to Bethsaida while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased, and they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, and their hearts were hardened. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So this passage in Mark, it's fascinating to me for a number of reasons, and just want to sort of walk through a few things that stand out to me, things I've seen in my study of it. And the first starts with the situation that the disciples find themselves in, right? So just before this, we've had this miraculous one of these feedings of thousands of people. And so then Jesus puts the disciples on a boat and he sends them away. And there are some scholars thinking that there was this incredible feeding, and then the crowds want to come and force Jesus to be their king. And so Jesus sends the disciples away, and then it says he dismisses the crowd and then goes up on the mountain to pray. But meanwhile, right, there's separation, right? The disciples are in this boat and they're heading out into the sea. And Jesus is up on the mountain. And so the disciples are isolated, right? They're physically far from God. And then the winds are against them. They're sort of beating into the wind, trying to get where they're going. And so they're facing opposition. It's nighttime. They're out on the sea alone. And I'm sure at times like this, they're wondering, like, where is Jesus? Like, why did Jesus send us here, right? They're asking these questions about how did we end up in this situation? This is not what we expected to be in, right? They're curious. Where is God in the midst of this? And what's going to happen to us out here in the sea with the wind beating against us, right? And this is a familiar situation for all of us, right? Maybe not the boating at night, but facing opposition and asking big questions, right? We face all sorts of opposition in life, from little things to huge things, and it changes the way we think, right? So, from little things, when, I get a splinter not too long ago from I was out in the garden weeding, and I thought I got it all out, but then, my finger kept getting redder and redder and more sensitive, and it distorted the way I was thinking about things, because it was this constant source of frustration. And, I was wondering, what it was going to do about it, what I had to do. And so finally I got a pair of tweezers and a knife, dug around in there for a while and got it out. But until I got that little splinter out, it was only going to get worse, that irritation. And it was distorting the way that I thought about all sorts of things, right? Because when little things frustrate us, it can pile up and pile up and pile up until we're just very frustrated and distracted, and we're not seeing things properly. And then there are big things we face, right? Job loss. Right? Relationship stress. We face these big opposition things in our lives, and we ask these big questions. Right? This past Friday, I called a dear friend, right, on what would have been her son's 40th birthday, and I've made that call every year for 22 years. Right? And it's never gotten easier. Right? And we ask the same questions now that we did 15, 20 years ago, right? It's this massive opposition against us, pushing against us. And we ask big questions. Why? And where is God in the midst of this? Which I think is so important about the church, because the church is a place where we can come together and we can see where other people are facing opposition too. And it's a comfort to us. And they help us think about things. It helps us frame the way we understand things. Right? But we still have questions. But what I love about this passage is that the disciples are in the boat, but Jesus hasn't forgotten about the disciples. Jesus has gone up onto the mountain to pray, and what does Jesus do while he's praying? He sees them in the boat, right? He saw that they were making headway painfully. He saw them, right? He kept his eye upon them. And so they're straining against the oars in the middle of the night, but he's in prayer and he's seeing them, which means he's praying about them, right? Which is what Jesus is doing. He's remembering us. They're on his mind as they try to follow his commands, even in the dark with the wind against them, right? So the disciples in the middle of the night, they haven't been forgotten by God. And it sort of reminds me of in Exodus, right? When the Israelites are crying out, they're in slavery in Egypt, they're crying out to God. And what does Exodus says is God hears their prayers. God hears their cries. God hears, God sees, right? That we aren't forgotten by God. And so moved by compassion, then he reaches out, and even though it will take a miracle to reach us, which is what we know, because right there in a boat in the middle of the lake, Jesus can't just jump out there, right? So even though it'll take a miracle, Jesus sets out to reach the disciples, right? And so when we face opposition in life, right, because none of us are promised a life without that, right, it's important to know that Jesus hasn't forgotten about us, right? He's praying and he's watching, and he will reach us even if it takes a miracle to do so. And it says that Mark tells us that Jesus intends to pass by the boat. And what that means is it doesn't mean that Jesus is trying to sneak around the boat in hopes they don't notice us. No, it's a language sort of from Exodus when God puts Moses in the cleft of a rock and his glory passes Moses by, and Moses gets a glimpse of that in the same way that Jesus comes to assure the disciples of the presence and the glory of God. So Jesus intends to pass by them so they can see his glory, so they can be comforted, right, in the night when they're facing opposition. But it's interesting. So it comes in the fourth watch. This is at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the disciples are convinced that they've seen a ghost. Right? Again, they're tired. They're facing opposition. It's in the middle of the night. They've been moving constantly, and they're worn out. And so they see someone walking, and they panic. Right? Their eyes deceive them, and it creates anxiety. And I keep thinking about that moment, right? They see Jesus, but their eyes tell them it has to be something else, something to fear. And so their reaction isn't what it should be because their eyes are deceived. Their hearts are deceived. And I was thinking, how often do our eyes and our hearts deceive us, right? Especially when we're tired, especially when we're facing opposition, right? When we're exhausted, when we're physically exhausted, when we're mentally exhausted, when we're spiritually exhausted. Right? And so we end up fearing something that we shouldn't be afraid of, right? We pull back because we perceive some threat. And so rather than engage with something, rather than engage with someone, we pull back out of fear. I spent 10 years dealing with constant anxiety, and it just rules your life, and it distorts and it deceives the way that we see the world. We don't see it the way it really is. We're seeing it through this lens of fear and this lens of anxiety. And we're all aware of the way, right, that media, and especially social media, right, tries to shape and tries, I think, in a lot of ways to make us afraid. And how does that deceive the way we see one another? How does that deceive the way we see the world? It's distorting our relationships. And so the question is, what do we do about it, right? Because fear is so paralyzing. And so what do we see the disciples doing, right? And so what happens is they hear the word of God, right? Jesus speaks to them. And he says, do not be afraid. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. And what's interesting, it's sort of the same formula that when God is speaking to Moses, and Moses says, well, what do I tell the people your name is? And God says, I am, right? And here we see the same thing. Jesus says, it is I, right? It is I who am. And Jesus is telling the disciples, right, that he is God, right? He's come in his glory. He's going to pass by them to assure them. And so Jesus is showing the disciples a glimpse of glory, and he's speaking to them. In their fear, when their eyes are deceiving them, he's speaking to them, giving them a word to comfort them. So their eyes and their hearts will no longer be deceived, but they'll see things as they really are. Right? And God continues to speak today. And this is why it's so important that we read the Bible, right? We don't do it just so we can check something off every day and say, look, God, I'm sort of being a good Christian. What we do is we read the Bible because it is how God speaks to us today. And it helps us to see things as we are. It can shake that distortion from us so our eyes and our hearts don't deceive us and see the world differently than it really is. Right? It reminds us, right, who is in charge of the universe. It shows us a glimpse of God's glory, and it helps us to not be afraid. So our eyes are not deceiving us, so we're not being led astray out of our exhaustion and out of fear. And we're being led by glory rather than fear. And so what happens, right, it's fascinating. So Jesus gets into the boat and immediately the winds die down and the disciples are amazed and they don't really understand. And it reminds me of this passage that we read earlier from Jonah, right? So Jonah is sent by God, and so Jonah takes a boat in the opposite direction because he's afraid and his fear is distorting him. And so he gets in a boat and he goes the other direction, and the storm comes up, and the sailors, they finally sort of realize what Jonah has done, and so they throw Jonah overboard into the stormy sea, into the waves as an offering to calm the chaos. They're afraid, and so they throw Jonah overboard as an offering. Right, but that doesn't happen here, right? Nobody has to be thrown overboard. And it's because the one who is truly going to be thrown overboard for all of us is there, right? Jesus is the one who's going to be thrown into the watery chaos, who's going to offer himself into the storm so that we may be safe in the boat, so that we, like Jonah, don't have to get chucked overboard when we're afraid, when we do things wrong. Jesus will willingly. He's the one who's willingly offering himself to calm the ultimate storm in life of sin and death. Right? He has mastery over the waters. He's demonstrating his glory here. And he'll demonstrate his devotion to us later. Right? When the Romans throw him overboard into the watery chaos of death. Right? The offering that only he can truly make to secure our place in the boat for eternity. So Jesus offers himself so that we don't have to. He's willing to face the storms that we can't. And because of him, we are saved. Thanks be to God.